Hello, and welcome back to Baby Elias's stories. We now return to America is in the Heart, a personal history by Carlos Bulosan. Foreword by Elaine, Castillo. My father, Ernesto Mabalon, choked back tears as we watched the doors of our family's old restaurant collapse under the bulldozer on a hot spring morning. That restaurant, that building, that place was the beginning of all of us, he said, his voice breaking. That was where we all came from. And then he turned away so I could not see his tears. Don Bohulano Mabalon. Little Manila is in the heart. I can't remember how old I was exactly when I first read Carlos Bulosan's America is in the Heart. Only that I was old enough to think I was mature, which means I couldn't have been more than 14. I know I didn't encounter the book in a classroom as some of my luckier friends did. I never met any Filipinx families in the books I read for school. I know I was already a voracious reader, and I'm almost certain I borrowed the book from Heaven on Earth, otherwise known to me at the time as the Milpitas Library. I know it wasn't the first book I'd read about Filipinx Americans or Asian Americans, and yet it was the first book in which I saw people who were like the people I came home to. Do you remember how old you were when you first read a book that had a character who looked and lived like you in it? Maybe the first book you read was like that, and every book after it since. And you never had to wonder about finding someone like yourself or the people who made you in books. You've always been right there at the center, unquestioned. Maybe someone who loved you, a parent, a teacher, a librarian, gave you the book with all the ceremony of an heirloom being passed down, extending a hand to save you because they, too, had once been saved in that way. Maybe you came to that book entirely alone and late in life and wished you had come to it younger, without so many of your scars. Maybe you still sometimes wonder about the kind of person you might have become if you'd found its pages back then. Maybe you never found the book at all and resigned yourself to the shape of that absence. Maybe you stopped looking altogether. Maybe you told yourself you stopped looking. Maybe you lied. Bulosan's America is in the Heart is not simply one of the most seminal texts of Filipinx American literature, a rangy and generous root from which spring many of our most beloved and urgent Filipinx writers, not to mention immigrant writers and writers of color across the country. It's also an American horror story of the highest order. The highest order being, of course, the historical. To not read it is, to put it simply, to not know America, to deprive oneself of the full backstory of the long, drawn-out, bloodied multiverse that is our shared history. Filipinx, American, everywhere in between. What you find in its pages is as regretfully alive today as it was in 1946, when the book was first published. Its stark depictions of the miseries of early immigrant life, particularly Filipinx and Mexican migrant labor on the West Coast in the 1930s. Its laceratingly familiar portrayals of white supremacy in action, including targeted police brutality, racist mobs attacking Filipinx and Mexican immigrant workers, trumped-up anxiety around the sexualized criminal menace supposedly posed by black and brown men, and historical amnesia around America's colonial atrocities, its determined take on capitalist exploitation and class inequality, both in the Philippines and America. For me, it was the first book I'd ever read whose main characters came from the rural poor of the Philippines, in particular, the rural poor from the province of Pangasinan, populated by people like my mother and her family. Bulosan's description of the region and its profound social disparities in the early part of the book ring true to the lives my mother, aunts, and grandmother lived. To read a book about Philippines characters who were not wealthy, educated, Manila-based, or remotely cosmopolitan, characters who would never own a Maria Clara, let alone be called one, felt like a rare gift. The dubious accompaniment of that gift, however, is another aspect of the book that is just as regretfully alive today as it was in 1946. The undeniable culture of misogyny in the book, which features scene after scene of women, usually poor and vulnerable, being brutalized, beaten, raped, disappeared. The violence against women in America is in the heart, is as frank and banal as it is apocalyptic, and it runs through the entire narrative like a vital vein. Bulosan's autobiographical protagonist is often sympathetic to the plight of these women, in the nice guy brand of sympathy, but he does not substantially connect these women's struggle with his own. There is no #MeToo for the women in Bulosan's pages. That disturbing and revelatory silence cannot be overlooked when we talk about the book's place in the canon and what it means. Teachers and writers often say that reading books gives us life tools, which is true. But those tools mean nothing without readers stepping up to the task of what those tools actually ask of us. Critical reading is a civil act. It's the kind of reading that asks you to be both sharp and vulnerable to both the world of the book and the world the book emerges from. The kind of reading that asks you to bear witness to the things in a book that speak low and deep to some low and deep part of you, which might not always say easy or comforting things. Critical reading returns you to your life with renewed eyes. It deepens the world for you, inasmuch as it deepens you for the world. And it's the things we do with the tools that reading gives us that have not just world building, but what we might call world remaking force. When we read a book like America is in the Heart, we have the chance to be not just readers of American horror history, but its witnesses and inheritors. Bulosan's novel is indispensable. So is confronting what lies in it. One of those acts of witnessing, of inheritance, is to make sure that America is in the Heart is not the only book we read about Philippines communities, and that if it is the first, it will not be the last. That we read more books about the Philippines, this diaspora, that aren't only written by and about hetero men. That we read more books about the Philippines diaspora that aren't only written by and about hetero men. That we seek out and lift up books by and about the kind of women who appear in America is in the Heart. Books in which those women aren't relegated to the bruised edge of the page. That we read and teach books about queer Philippines characters who don't often find themselves centered in nation-defining epics. That we push back against the idea of nation-defining epics in the first place. As a Philippines writer, I know well that I'm one of Bulosan's many children. It's a fact I cherish with my whole heart. I also know that to be part of a family also often means having to fight, and that fighting with your family is sometimes a way of fighting for them. When I wrote my first novel, the epigraph I chose came from "America is in the heart." I knew I could trust a gambler because I had been one. It's a small line, and yet it's one of my most beloved sentences, not just in Bulosan's book, but in any book. The narrator is talking about pawning a stolen ring to a gambler to get the money to pay for a doctor to see his brother, along with groceries for his brother to last 3 months, rent, etc. It's of course not just a line about gambling, it's also, crucially, a line about community. In particular, it's a line about people making community between their own vulnerabilities and the vulnerabilities of others, between their own flaws and mendacities and the flaws and mendacities of others. It's a line that reminds us that real communities aren't formed with only the best and brightest parts of who we are. Community is granular, piecemeal, and daily, fastened together, one stolen ring at a time. And like much of the book, the line gives not comfort, but solace. Solace in the old roots of the word, where it once also meant to reconcile. This is also what critical reading of our histories makes possible. We cannot repair what we cannot reconcile. We cannot truly know what we will not truly see. America is in the heart asks nothing less of us than to try to see America, because it knows that only that which really sees us will really free us. Representation is one of those words that's as inadequate as tolerance. When we're talking about the force that art can have in our lives, we know that no one wants to be simply represented, in the same way that no one wants to be simply tolerated. Representation doesn't come remotely close to describing the viscerally intimate shock of what it feels like when you encounter a book that seems to see you, the language you speak, the people you know, the town you call home. It just makes you feel real. For people who are used to feeling real, used to always seeing and affirming their own reality, not just depicted, but centered. Anywhere from the page to the screen to the echoing halls of government, the force of that feeling might easily be underestimated. But it is a force indeed. Its other name might be called justice or love. Bulosan knew that force well. His pages radiate with it. It's what I suspect is really in the book's heart. Elaine Castillo. Introduction. When America is in the Heart, AIH, appeared in 1946, the Philippines was about to receive formal independence from the United States after 4 harrowing years of Japanese barbarism. Filipinos thanked the troops of General Douglas MacArthur for their liberation. Bulosan's book was praised less for its progressive sentiments than for its affirmation of the sacrifices made in Bataan and Corregidor, memorialized for their promise of complete national liberation. Bulosan tried to capture the pathos of a long-awaited moment of reunion with missing brothers and lost compatriots. Victory over Japan seemed to wipe out the trauma of the United States' bloody pacification of the islands from 1899 to 1913, an experience alluded to in Bulosan's farewell to his brother Leon, a veteran of the European carnage that occurred thousands of miles away from Binalonan, Pangasinan, where Bulosan was born on November 2, 1911. After his birth, the final phase of the Filipino-American War ended when General Pershing's troops slaughtered 10,000 Moros in the Bud Bagsak massacre on June 11, 1913. Add this toll to about 1 million natives killed earlier, and we arrived at the initial fruit of President McKinley's benevolent assimilation policy justifying the new empire's possession. Soon the newly established school system and William Howard Taft's Filipinization program produced a venal bureaucratic caste with close ties to the landlords and compradors that colluded with the new rulers through the Commonwealth period from 1935 to 1946. When this oligarchy accepted the onerous conditions of independence in July 1946, Stanley Carnell wryly remarked, "They submitted voluntarily to their own exploitation, eager to become a favored and exemplary party within a Pax Americana." Bulosan's advent into the world was thus haunted with such paradoxes and perverse quandaries. His initiation was self-contradictory, his psyche charged with aberrant impulses and dispositions. Negativity saturated the milieu. Jamie Veneracion remarks that while the Americans supposedly introduced land reform, the effect was the intensification of the tenancy problem. Fierce antagonisms convulsed the impoverished countryside. Fierce antagonisms convulsed the impoverished countryside. One charismatic folk hero, Philip Salvador, was hanged for leading a massive insurrection against landlords and their U.S. patrons. Between his birth and his departure for the United States in 1930, Bulosan might have reflected on the desperate revolts of peasants throughout the archipelago. In part 1 of America is in the Heart, he describes the 1931 Tayug uprising near his birthplace, which he didn't personally witness. It was led by Pedro Calosa, a veteran of union activism in Hawaii, who was jailed for instigating multi-ethnic strikes and summarily deported back to the colony in 1927. Intractable Voyagers. How did Filipinos suddenly show up in Hawaii? After 3 decades of imperial tutelage, the Philippines was transformed into a classic dependency providing raw materials and cheap labor. Pull and push factors were involved. From 1907 to 1926, more than 100,000 Filipinos were recruited by the Hawaiian plantations when Japanese immigration was prohibited. Driven by poverty and feudal coercions, the natives plotted their journey to pursue the American dream of success, broadcast so seductively in the textbooks and mass media that mesmerized Bulosan and his generation. Neither sojourners nor aliens, they border-crossed as wards or nationals. Neither immigrants nor foreigners, they were denied citizenship, wandering from rural countryside to city ghettos and back. As Carrie McWilliams observed, they were neither fish nor fowl. They explored an enigmatic terra incognita filled with extravagant fantasies and tragicomic comeuppances. These expatriates shared W.E.B. Du Bois's predicament of double consciousness, a condition of intermittent crisis sprung from years of slavery, serfdom, and capitalist bondage. It was a hazardous passage that may explain the ironic turnabouts and precarious balancing acts of Bulosan's characters, a plight analogous to the misfortunes of the European peasantry when the enclosures of the commons engendered banditry, anarchic mayhem, and rogues. A profane Saturnalia staged by a fabled ensemble of tricksters, derelict jokesters, and rambunctious fugitives. In this zone of contingencies, Bulosan found himself struggling to survive with his cohort in the midst of the Great Depression. They became easy prey to labor contractors, gamblers, hired vigilantes, and officials, prohibiting their marriage with whites. From Hawaii to Alaska. Naive and vulnerable, they nurtured a sophisticated culture of subterfuge and defiance. Bulosan's friendship with militant unionist Chris Mensalvas plunged him into the campaigns of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, and the 1933 strike of 4,000 Filipinos in California. Bulosan soon became acquainted with Richard Wright, William Saroyan, Louis Adamic, and Harriet Monroe, among others. Confined at the Los Angeles General Hospital from 1936 to 1938, Bulosan was shrewdly apprenticed to a writing vocation by Sonora and Dorothy Babb. They helped him discover through books all my world of intellectual possibilities and the grand dream of battering society for the working man. While convalescing, he composed fiction satirizing feudal savagery and colonial despotism, later gathered in the laughter of my father, hereafter laughter. U.S. colonialism dissolved traditional affinities and preserved tribal customs. Bulosan's adolescent years drew energy from the survival craft of a poor peasant clan in which the fathers and uncles had to reckon with maternal cunning and bureaucratic humbuggery. Just as the wily spirit of his father rooted landlords, merchant usurers, and comprador flunkies, Bulosan's compatriots deployed their wits to safeguard their dignity. In reconstructing his past, Bulosan revitalized the rich, insurgent culture of the dispossessed. He diagnosed the syndrome of a rapid changing society, its treacherous compromises and pious irrationalities. In response to the Philistine put-down of laughter as a mode of commercializing exotic Moors, Bulosan urged us to attend more to their imminent critique. My politico-economic ideas are embedded in all my writings. Laughter is not humor, it is satire. It is indictment against that economic system that stifled the growth of the primitive, making him decadent overnight. Other stories by Bulosan, In the Philippines is in the Heart, exuded hidden bitterness, couched in dark humor. His antidote to an imputed pastoral optimism, they historicized folk tales lampooning the impostures of the oligarchy and the iniquitous property relations sanctioned by the prevalent social Darwinist ideology of the time. Agonizing over his kin's tribulations, Bulosan rediscovered the homeland in the archive of peasant rebellions. Self-centered alienation begot its opposite in trusting collaboration. Bulosan's education as an emergent intellectual of the diaspora began with the effort to understand the trials of his family to endure feudal colonial outrages. Critical distance and historical perspective overcame despair. Although laughter and AIH evinced his creative potential. Unlike his contemporary Jose Garcia Villa, Bulosan was never really accepted by the establishment literati. He remained suspect, a disgruntled pariah from the boondocks. His radicalization was sparked by acts of spontaneous remembrance triggered by rabid ostracism. Even before his anger and fear subsided with the war's end, Bulosan had already outlined his project of repraising the U.S. cultural landscape with his claim, "I want to interpret the soul of the Filipinos. What really compelled me to write was to try to understand this country, to find a place in it not only for myself, but for my people." Autobiography, page 267. Mapping the labyrinthine route. Originally acclaimed as a poignant testimonial of ethnic success, America in the Heart's epilogue envisages a popular front response to international fascism. Written during the war, Bulosan's quasi-autobiography, its narrator functions as a mediating persona, unfolds a geopolitical transcript of those years of thwarting white supremacist violence, obliquely parodying the Bildungsroman model, the Bildungsroman novel of growing up. AIH presents a thick ethnograph of various patterns of brutal exploitation and spiritual injury suffered by Filipinos from the Depression to the end of World War II, drifting in a limbo of indeterminacy. Bulosan survived years of ignominy and unquiet desperation, nurturing libertarian affections and perceptions. On the eve of Pearl Harbor, he conceptualized his ordeals. "Yes, I feel like a criminal, running away from a crime I did not commit, and the crime is that I am a Filipino in America." We are confronted outright with scenes of abuse, arrests, and the ruthless killing of Bulosan's companions. Basically, the narrator, as protagonist or witness, charts the passage of the youthful sensibility through a landscape of cruel privations and melodramatic entanglements. Snapshots of history are spliced with incidents of strife, escape, and recovery. A tense montage mixing public events, confessional diary, and raw front-line reports. Bulosan's itinerary of self-discovery begins with his victimization by corrupt businessmen upon his arrival. After a series of escapades, the narrator concludes, Pollyanna-like, by vindicating his faith in America. It's no longer an arena of painful bloodletting, but a magical space sprung from all our hopes and aspirations. Readers are stunned by the stark disjunction between the harsh reality and the compensatory frame of the commentary. How do we reconcile this incongruity between actuality and thought? Ugly fact and glamorized America. Is this simply a sly maneuver to hide subversive author? Is this simply a sly maneuver to hide subversive author behind credulous narrator? One way of clearing up this impasse of discrepant readings has become routine. We need to reject the thesis that this work belongs to that genre of personal reminiscence designed to induce easy assimilation into the proverbial melting pot. It is congenial to welcome AIH as a specimen of a new artistic invention that functions as the negation of the foolish scheme for whitening dark-skinned subalterns. This prompts us to value rhetorical nuances, such as the address to the American earth, cast in the subjunctive mood, overshadowed by the disasters of Pearl Harbor, Bataan, and Corregidor. Forking arguments, Converging questions. The mainstream approach to Bulosan's work is charitable but disingenuous. To judge Bulosan's chronicle of the Filipino struggle to restore damaged lives as an ethnocentric language game seems unconscionable, if not invidious. Essentially, we are following a story of a group lost in a maze of delusions, harassed, trapped, and compelled to find out who they really are by exigent conduct and self-reflection. The Bulosan persona storytelling is an allegorical search for purposeful identity via group empathy. Deploying the underdog's ruses, he grapples with the bifurcating trajectory of his passage through the capitalist maelstrom. Seeking to unify fragmented lives, he moves apart, but later rejoins his group when he extols the simplicity of their hearts, nourished in the conviction that America is still our unfinished dream. Purged of his narcissistic malaise, he proudly announces, "I was rediscovering myself in their lives." Thus, the idea of containment, imaged by the title, refers to a labor of intensifying self-awareness. In effect, America, as heterogeneous experience, becomes condensed in the artist's sensibility, the informed heart. Using this quest for identity as a point of departure, we discern the crucial turn of Bulosan's life in chapter 23. Struggling to communicate with his brothers, he reconstitutes his past and gains release from the prison of silence to tell the world what they've done to me. The victim recovers poise and mutates into a participant, fusing theory and practice. This discovery of the capacity for truth-telling speech occurs after he rebels. "I had struck at the white world at last, and I felt free." When he meets the lawyer Pascual, Bulosan recovers his reflexive identity and assumes his role as witness/spokesperson for grassroots mobilization. Meanwhile, he reconceives literary art as the symbolic theater of his death and rebirth, and his role within it as a transformative agent, a productive trans-individual, belonging to a community of equals, acting in synergy with nature and secular traditions. A decisive break occurs in the end, which downplays the iconic aura of the assimilated subaltern. Bulosan's fantasy of making a better America is aborted by the body's collapse. History's upside-down tendency manifests itself in the return of the narrator as child/invalid. The voyager's hubris now displaced by the impact of his odyssey. Epitomized here is the vitality of the romance genre. The cycle of death and rebirth with its contrapuntal dialectic of tragic and comic elements. Bulosan celebrates several deaths, one of which is the suicide of Esteban, which precipitates a profound conversion. "I began to rediscover my native land and the cultural roots there that had nourished me, and I felt a great urge to identify myself with the social awakening of my people." Inventory of the spirit. What is timely to pursue here is the motif of a prophesied homecoming performed in the dream, chapter 40, a cynic douche for what is repressed. Mistaken as the Filipino communist strike leader, Bulosan flees from the police. Asleep on a bus, he dreams of his return to his hometown, rejoicing at seeing his mother and the whole family eating together. Jolted by tears of remembrance, he asks himself how the tragedy of his childhood had returned in his sleep because I had forgotten it. What had been erased from the psyche was his adolescence, an amnesia of profound ethico-political significance. Meanwhile, we detect a symptomatic shift in texture and style. The memoir's realistic stance and its picaresque neutralism, marked by the intrusions of rough idiom, squalid atmosphere, etc., are disrupted by nostalgic, lyrical evocations of a happy, beautiful homeland. By this time, the norms of conventional fiction, with its typical coding for verisimilitude, and linear plotting, have already been scrambled by a comic rhythm of parody and carnivalesque debunking. After the dream, we observe how the narrator's ego merges with the spirit of an enlarged ensemble whose members are bound by a transcendent purpose, the worldwide crusade against fascist terrorism. This connects with what Bulosan would later call the revolution, where workers would play our own role in the turbulent drama of history, the one and only common thread that bound us together, white and black and brown in America. Earlier, Bulosan harped on the notion of the old world dying while a new world is struggling to be born. America is in the hearts of men that died for freedom, a prophecy of a new society. Framed by Bulosan's cathartic discovery of his writing prowess, the invocation of America as a multi-ethnic army of workers reconfirms his project of re-articulating the discourse of immigrant rights in a communalist direction. Note how the story's register switches from a catalogue of pain to a visionary prospect of an emancipated future. This utopian theme of regenerating as co-workers within the morass of a decaying order qualifies the text's morbid realism, while the insightful tone compensates for the disoriented narrative flow and the episodic plot. Eventually, the call for partisanship animates the rationale of his support for the proletarian vanguard in the Spanish Civil War. The key historical contradiction in the book that subtly inflects the polarities of city and countryside, metropole and colony, innovative consciousness and the instrumentalizing public sphere. Bulosan's journey now arrives at the all-embracing principle of the popular front against fascism. It offers one mode of reconciling an idealized America and the actuality of racist dehumanization. The dissolution of the old order signaled by the war's outbreak offers the chance to resolve the tension between vacuous idealism and mimetic historiography, a compensatory fulfillment of the natives' aspirations. As exiles, socially strangled in America, Filipinos, Bulosan speculates, find it easier to integrate ourselves in a universal idea, serving as organic tribunes of the wretched of the earth. Engaging women's time. From a historical materialist perspective, AIH may be appraised as an example of new literary form. A popular front allegory capturing the frightful landscape of the Depression and total warfare. This form articulates the problems of class, race, nation, and gender in an over-determined unity of opposites, a troubling cacophony of voices. Bakhtin's heteroglossia. The irksome undecidability of Duboisian consciousness, to clear up this dissonance, we can foreground the trope of personification, the riddle of what signifies, quote-unquote, America. Bulosan answers, Elaine Odell was undeniably the American I had wanted to find in those frantic days of fear and flight. This America was human, good, and real. If Elaine serves as a placeholder for all those who demonstrated compassion for its victims, then America is not a chimerical, abstract place. Rather, it alludes to a redemptive force, the locus of a germinal nomadic desire. What I think constitutes AIH's originality is its rendering of what Julia Kristeva calls women's time. This is the work's subtext or political unconscious. Probing women's role in Bulosan's pilgrimage, we encounter representatives of its otherness, its demystifying double. One recalls how Bulosan praised the exuberant resourcefulness of his mother, that dynamic little peasant woman. To know my mother's name was to know the password into the secrets of the past, a guiding star, a talisman, a charm that lights us to manhood and decency. Her uncanny figure is sublimated in the feisty women challenging patriarchal authority. She is reincarnated in Bulosan's caring companions, symbols of the disavowed other, opposing an indifferent, if not inhospitable America, making AIH a proto-feminist discourse interweaving the nomadic and sedentary lines of flight and confrontation. An intriguing approach to AIH's complexity is to consider it a hypothetical construct meant to resolve lived conflicts by an imaginary resolution. We can explore this angle by inquiring into women's time, the subterranean logic of need and desire. This would modify the reader's horizon of expectation, since what this recollection wants to forget, but cannot, is a Lucana whose subliminal traces serve as the stigmata of insurrectos, the genocidal U.S. pacification that preserved comprador-landlord power. The comprador-landlord bloc suppressed numerous peasant uprisings and drove Bulosan and his generation into exile. Toward the end, Japanese aggression invokes the U.S. conquest, the primal shock of deracination becoming the repressed traumatic object. In effect, what Bulosan wants to salvage are the ruined workers whose bodies and souls have been price tagged by the devouring flux of America, where Filipino bachelors have found themselves symbolically, if not literally, castrated. A life world corrupted by the predatory market and acquisitive individualism now sanctified by the bankrupt administered culture reigning worldwide. EXILE'S rendezvous. The war was almost over when Bulosan's adventure halted. MacArthur's slogan, "I shall return," had fired up Filipino hopes, motivating Bulosan's reassessment of the total experience of his generation. In this context, the intent of America is in the heart can be construed as the reinscription of the inaugural moment of loss in the archive of American exceptionalism. We witness in the end the ambivalent gestures of the narrator striving to find coherence and intelligibility to universalize the lessons of his experience. Prophetic reminiscence foregrounds the tillers' cooperative sharing and maternal love as the ground of spirit and destiny. The final episodes intimate a return to the source. inducing a need to valorize a durable tradition of plebeian resistance based on solidarity, the concrete universal of this artifice. Whatever the reader's prejudices, AIH seeks to provoke everyone about their role in the open-ended drama of social transformation. Our world was this one, but a new one was being born. We belong to the old world of confusion, but in this other world, new, bright, promising, we would be unable to meet its demands. This book calls for the renewal of the incommensurable energies in concrete experience, the oppositional and the utopian drives stifled by commodity fetishism. For this purpose, we need an interpretive method to transcode the dilemmas portrayed here into humankind's agon of exposing lies, discriminating what is reactionary and what is life-enhancing. In the bewildering panorama of daily life, mindful of the uncouth realism used to depict existential truths, we can appreciate AIH's modernist temper in privileging self-reflexive inquiry and secular humanism. Has the postmodernist taste for cynical deconstructivism rendered this book inutile? Extrapolated from the vicissitudes of the popular democratic struggles, AIH allegorizes the transformation of the old system of colonial servitude and silence into a contested space where embodied ideas clash, catalyzed by historic contingencies. This process of decolonization, personified by the witness/testifier of AIH, aims to fashion a responsible trans-individual subject, not a hustling entrepreneur through rational analysis and convivial exchanges. Given the responsibilities Bulosan wrestled with, we can appreciate how the evolution of his sensibility transcended the demands of sectarian ideology, the cult of a native golden age and hedonistic cosmopolitanism. No doubt Bulosan's conscientization transgressed nation-state paradigms and upheld proletarian internationalism. Bulosan's engagement with the Popular Front strategy afforded him a synthesizing worldview that gave direction to his group's wayward journey. When war broke out, Bulosan rediscovered the beleaguered islands as the mainspring of his commitment to national democratic emancipation in AIH, as well as in The Cry and the Dedication, hereafter The Cry, a novel inspired by Bulosan's friendship with the socialist poet Amando V. Hernandez, with whom he collaborated in publicizing Luis Taruc's autobiography, Born of the People. Reconnaissance and Intervention. At the start of the Cold War, Bulosan was virtually a blacklisted writer. The recent release of his FBI files seems an anticlimactic but fortuitous expose of dirty linen. Bulosan's intimacy with the Bab sisters, active in the Hollywood circle of fellow traveling intellectuals, was public knowledge. As a journalist with the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union, ILWU, Bulosan was surveilled as a dangerous subversive, threatened with deportation. But how can you deport a writer commissioned to write an essay to celebrate one of Roosevelt's 4 freedoms, then on exhibit with an artwork at the Federal Building in San Francisco? By the end of the McCarthy witch hunt in 1954, Bulosan enjoyed a modest, if surreptitious, prestige. The best-selling Laughter had been translated into over a dozen languages, while AIH had been favorably reviewed and the author cited in Who's Who in America, Current Biography, and others. Meanwhile, he was drafting The Cry, his saga of hook guerrillas reconstructing their nation's history as they sought to establish linkage with US-based sympathizers. Charting the often interrupted self-fashioning of the Filipino subject, The Cry may be read as a cartographic fantasy of performing the quest for self-determination. What impelled Bulosan to write? My grand dream of equality among men and freedom for all. Above all and ultimately to translate the desires and aspirations of the whole Filipino people in the Philippines and abroad in terms relevant to contemporary history. On Becoming, page 216. Bulosan died on September 11, 1956, shortly after the Korean War ended, within earshot of the portentous rumblings from Indochina. In retrospect, the tensions of the Cold War offered an occasion for Bulosan to redefine the travails of the wretched multitude. In grappling with life and death situations, he analyzed the insidious contagion of racism/sexism that complicated the epochal antagonism between capitalism and socialist experiments carried out since the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. A decade after his death, Filipino farm workers mounted the 1965 strike that led to the founding of the United Farm Workers of America, thanks to pioneering efforts of the CIO, ILWU, and other groups whose leaders were hounded by the FBI. Filipinos joined coalitions with African Americans, Native Americans, women, and others in the civil rights struggles, reviving memories of centuries-old resistance, an epic of heroic soul-making. Its genealogy was already prefigured in Bulosan's aide-memoir, How My Stories Were Written, in which an old village storyteller is revealed as his ancestral progenitor, the matrix of all the wisdom of the heart. How My Stories, page 142. Amid the controversy over immigration today, over 3 million Filipinos in the United States are preponderant stakeholders in the reshaping of civil society. Bulosan sought to substantiate their presence in this chronicle of the subaltern's quest for justice, equality, and respect. Before he died, Bulosan reaffirmed his conviction in the virtue of collective praxis as emblematic of humanity's potential for reconfiguring history. Writing was not sufficient. The most decisive move that the writer could make was to take his stand with the workers. Writer as worker, page 31. As long as the Philippines remains a neo-colonial backwater and the diaspora languishes in obsessive consumerism, Bulosan's works will remain serviceable as speculative tools for diagnosing its unhappy consciousness and its ethos of resentment, compromise, and disobedience. What Mark Twain called the Philippines' temptation when the United States tamed those wild Malays, the scandalous spectacle of the Yankee Republic subjugating millions who refused to be enslaved, yielded a sharp, joyful response to which Bulosan's life work, with its moral cogency and provocative gravitas, bears witness. E. San Juan Jr.